Ever since the AT&T-T-Mobile merger fell through last month, a lot of questions have been raised about the future of the two companies. The proposed deal received a significant amount of criticism, which is ultimately why it was abandoned, but it did have a considerable amount of support as well. And among the supporters was former Congressman and Internet Innovation Alliance Honorary Chairman rboucher, who believed the deal would have a positive impact on the mobile industry. And the Congressman is joining us now by way of Skype to talk about the next steps for these companies. Thank you for joining us again, Congressman. It's a real pleasure.
Well, it's my pleasure. This is the second conversation we've had, and I look forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. Well, for starters, were you surprised when AT&T withdrew its deal to purchase T-Mobile?
Well, I was not surprised by that decision, given what had happened prior to the time that the application was withdrawn. Both the FCC and the Department of Justice had indicated that they disfavor the merger for different reasons, but largely based on their concern about its effect on competition. There were many strong reasons this merger should have been approved. If AT&T had been able to merge with T-Mobile, the company had promised that within a period of 6 years, it would expand broadband to 97% of the American public. And that is an improvement that we urgently need. There are more than 30 million Americans today who don't have access to broadband. Many more do not have broadband at speeds that are adequate to meet modern business needs. And this merger would have solved that problem. It would have brought the fourth generation of wireless technology with blazing fast connection speeds to 97% of our country within a period of 6 years, almost achieving the president's goal of 98% penetration within 5 years. So there were strong public policy reasons for the merger. That is why I supported it. That point aside, the Department of Justice, the FCC disagreed. And now I think we simply have to decide what the next steps are. AT&T obviously needs more spectrum. It needs to stabilize and strengthen its networks in the markets that it currently serves. Many of the urban areas around the country are experiencing spectrum stress because of the uptake of smartphone use on the AT&T network. And additional spectrum is needed in order to resolve those constraints. And then, of course, the additional spectrum will be very helpful in expanding broadband nationwide. And so AT&T obviously will be looking now at additional options to acquire spectrum and to strengthen its network. You had asked just briefly about T-Mobile or mentioned T-Mobile in the course of introducing this conversation. And I might add that with regard to T-Mobile, this is a very strong company also. It has the opportunity now to become a vital competitor in the space. It needs to develop a plan and the financing in order to deploy the fourth generation of wireless technology across its footprint. And I think that probably is the single largest challenge that T-Mobile faces at the present time.
Right. Well, as you said when we spoke previously, you said the deal would help fulfill President Obama's broadband plan. So since it didn't go through, do you think his plan will be met now?
I certainly hope that it will. The best way to have done it would have been for AT&T and T-Mobile to merge. There are other possible ways that it can happen, but unfortunately, I think these other avenues may involve a substantial amount of government investment in deploying broadband networks in those areas where the populations are small and the terrains are challenging, and it's hard to make a business case for that reason for the private carriers to expand broadband on their own. Typically, in that kind of circumstance, the way that broadband gets built is with government support, subsidies, and other kinds of direct government participation. This era of concern about deficit spending, finding those investments is going to be very difficult.
At a recent investor conference in San Francisco, John Stankey of AT&T said that the company had no regrets for pursuing the merger. But do you think that it will try again in some form to make this work?
Oh, I can't speculate about that. T-Mobile and AT&T appear to be going their separate ways now. Both companies are developing separate strategies to meet their business needs and realize their opportunities. Who can say what the future holds? But for the moment, it appears that the companies are going their separate ways.
AT&T had, of course, issued some goals provided that the merger would go through. Do you think that it can execute these goals without T-Mobile?
I think it's difficult for AT&T to do without the T-Mobile merger the things it promised that it would do with the merger. AT&T was going to experience substantial savings from the combining of these networks that would enable it to use that saved money in order to deploy fourth generation technology to 97% of the American public, and do so within about a half a decade. It's hard to see at the moment where those extra monies now come from. So my guess, and it's just a guess, I haven't had a discussion with the company about this, but my guess is that AT&T at this point is going to focus on strengthening its network in its core areas, building out its fourth generation technology on an incremental basis, market by market, as it sees an opportunity for that investment to realize the highest rate of return. And instead of it happening within 6 years on a nationwide basis, undoubtedly without this merger having occurred, that may now take a somewhat longer period of time.
Of course. Well, as you said, the company is reportedly in the process of purchasing licenses for the 700 megahertz spectrum, which some people believe is part of its backup plan for the failed merger. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the 700 megahertz spectrum is where the fourth generation of wireless technology is being deployed. The various carriers are using 700 megahertz for that. It's a currently vacant spectrum. It was vacated by the broadcasters when the digital transition from analog broadcasting to digital took place 5 years ago. And now that spectrum, having been auctioned to the carriers, is available for the deployment of fourth generation wireless technology. So that is AT&T's plan. They purchased a large amount of that spectrum in the government auction at the time that the broadcaster transition took place, and obviously they're in the market for more. That was the underlying rationale for the T-Mobile merger, the opportunity to have access both to AT&T's 700 megahertz spectrum and also the T-Mobile spectrum, some of which was 700, but some of which was in other bands as well.
Let's talk a little bit about T-Mobile now. You of course mentioned that it is a strong company rather, but now going forward, AT&T obviously had to pay T-Mobile some money. So what do you think? What's basically your speculations for it, both in the short term and long term?
Well, T-Mobile is the fourth largest wireless carrier in the United States. It has a very broad nationwide footprint. It acquired spectrum a number of years ago and has recently acquired more. That puts it in a very strong position to be a viable competitor. I think the challenge that T-Mobile faces is acquiring the capital that is necessary to deploy fourth generation technology across its network. That is going to be necessary for T-Mobile to compete effectively. That is the technology that enables blazing fast speeds of up to 20 megabits per second, which compared to the current speed of less than 2 megabits per second is quite robust. And people are going to want that higher speed, that accessibility. And it also offers the opportunity to serve the enterprise market of fixed customers, not just mobile customers, who can actually use that 20 megabit per second connection in lieu of a cable modem connection or a DSL connection for their business needs. And so without the ability to use that fourth generation technology, I think T-Mobile is going to be constrained. So obviously the strategy that company has is acquiring the financing necessary in order to deploy fourth generation technology. The $4 billion that AT&T paid upon dissolution of the merger proposal is a start. That is not enough. I think there's another question. Deutsche Telekom owns T-Mobile, and Deutsche Telekom had made it very clear that it intends to exit the United States market. It doesn't intend to remain a business participant here. T-Mobile was clearly for sale. It was a question of who would buy it. As far as I know, that is still the operating principle. I don't think Deutsche Telekom has announced that it now intends to stay within this market. So while T-Mobile is searching for the financing to build out its network, there is the question about the corporate form that T-Mobile is going to take. What is Deutsche Telekom going to do with it? Will it spin it off? Will there be a public offering for T-Mobile and U.S. shares here in the United States that would comprise the T-Mobile interest? Or will they sell that as a block of shares to someone else who would then have operating control of the company? I think that's a development to watch for the future. We don't know at the moment the answer to that question either.
Right, and Sprint, who was very vocal in its opposition of the deal, has been speculated to be a potential purchaser of T-Mobile. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's going to be very difficult for any of the major carriers to purchase T-Mobile, given the position of the Department of Justice and the FCC. AT&T was certainly not the largest spectrum owner in the country. Sprint, if you count as part of the total, the Clearwire spectrum, and Sprint is the majority shareholder of Clearwire. If you combine those together, those two companies are the largest spectrum holder in the United States. AT&T actually ranked third because Verizon owned more spectrum than AT&T as well, and that is the situation today. I think it's going to be very difficult to have a combination of Sprint with T-Mobile for the very reasons that the AT&T T-Mobile combination was disapproved. I think it would be very difficult impossible in fact, for Verizon to acquire T-Mobile. And so I think to the extent that T-Mobile is purchased by another carrier in the US, it's going to have to be someone far smaller than T-Mobile. Perhaps its network will be sold in parts. Hopefully that will not happen. I think there's great value in having the nationwide footprint and being able to offer that service across the entire nation. And hopefully it will not become a parceled out network, but this is a world where business dominates, and I think Deutsche Telekom will make its decisions very carefully based upon the relative value of the business offers that are made.
Right. Well, what is the long-term impact on the mobile industry of this deal not going through?
Well, I think the long-term impact is that we don't get the deployment of fourth-generation technology to 97% of the American public within the next half-decade. I think that's the major negative impact. And that's a shame. I'm from a rural area. I had the most rural congressional district in the state of Virginia. It's also the westernmost congressional district, and it's a mountainous area. We have lots of small communities that are barriered by mountains from the larger metropolitan areas. And these areas today have not had substantial broadband investment. It's just too expensive to string the fiber optic lines across those mountains in order to serve a very small, isolated population. Wireless technology was the answer. This was the way that for communities like that in my old district and in thousands of other communities like that across the nation, we were going to bring broadband to the broadband have-nots. I'm not sure what the answer is now. Ultimately, wireless is the better solution, but I'm not sure who's going to provide that wireless service, given the fact that it's still expensive to put up those towers, and without savings from something like the AT&T T-Mobile merger, it's difficult to see how AT&T can afford to do that on the same time frame it had projected if the merger were approved. And I'm not sure what other carriers can afford to do it either.
All right, then. Well, we'll see what happens. Thank you so much for talking with us, Congressman. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to discuss this with you today.
You're very welcome. All right, with this WebPro News Report, I'm Abby Johnson.